There we go. I'm on? Very good. It was just after their 50th wedding anniversary, and they were in their rockers, kind of overlooking their spread on the back porch. And, well, he was just kind of caught up in the moment. You know, the sunset was setting and going down. The sky was beautiful, and he looked in the glow of his wife's now aging face. He was overcome. He said, "Honey, after all these years, I just want to say, you're tried and true." And she was kind of hard of hearing. She wrinkled her forehead and she said, "I'm tired of you too." But something had held them together all those years, right? Well, what is it that made the friendship of Jonathan and David so powerful, so loyal, so life-changing, so life-giving? At the very core of it, like that marriage, at the very core of it was covenant. There was a covenant commitment to one another. And Jonathan and David don't cut covenant just once. If you read the story and throughout the book of 1 Samuel, it happens at least 3 times. That's like getting married and having 2 renewal services there afterwards. You understand? So they just kept recommitting themselves to one another in this holy covenant. So let me take just a few moments this morning to just point out some things about the nature of covenant, because it'll ring this morning in how they lived it out. First of all, if we can go to the next slide. First of all, covenants, almost all covenants, especially biblical covenants, had these basics intact. And as it refers to the covenants of Jonathan and David, you see pieces of this, but never in any of those accounts are all these things mentioned, though we might assume that they actually happened if they cut covenant in the traditional way. First of all, whenever 2 parties made this kind of commitment with one another, it didn't matter if it was 2 individuals or 2 tribes, there would be a representative of those people that came forward to actually cut covenant for those people. You did it for your people. And those 2 representatives would come before one another. And as the representatives of those people, whatever happened to these 2 was symbolically happening. The bond that they were creating was a bond that was being created between the people that they represented. They would give each other, first of all, their coat. They would take off their coat and give it to one another. And I've read that was a way of almost exchanging identity. It was a way of sharing identity. Like when a young lady wears her football player's letter jacket. You know, some of you are old enough to remember that. Their sweater, you know, their senior ring, all that kind of stuff. That's a way of blending identities, of claiming identity with one another. And that's what the giving of the coat was. It was a giving of one's covering. And it was basically saying, where you go, I go. What happens to you happens to me. If anybody picks on you, they get the 2 of us, right? And sometimes that's just instinctively in relationships. But in covenant, it's pledged and then it's lived out. Sometimes it happens instinctively. When Jonathan and David were 3 or 4 years old in grade school, some kids were picking on David on the other side of the art table. And when I went to pick them up after preschool that morning, she said, "Pastor, we had a little incident this morning." I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yeah, a couple of kids were picking on David, and David's pretty tough. He was ignoring it, but Jonathan was on the other side of the table. Pastor, he came over the table, and all I heard him say, 'Not my David.'" Right? That Jonathan and David were like the original Jonathan and David. They had each other's backs, and that was something that they lived out from the heart. But when these 2 representatives came to make this covenant, it wasn't written in paper, But it was before God, they would cut a covenant. It started with the cutting of a sacrifice. It was something you did in the eye of God. And in the name of your highest loyalty, you make this vow and this commitment. As two people stand before a crowd today getting married, they take their vows in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Same kind of stuff is going on. They're looking above saying, God, by your faithfulness, empower my faithfulness to keep this word. God said, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Don't say, don't pledge yourself, don't vow to love someone in my name and then tarnish my name by taking that lightly. Understand what he's saying? It's taking the Lord's name in vain is not really about cussing. It's about something far more at the heart of what holds humanity together, right? After you pledge your highest loyalty to God, the second wave of commandment, when it starts turning towards humanity and away from, thou shalt have no other God before me, thou shalt have no idols or make any graven images, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. It goes from this relationship to empowering these relationships always. Covenant took all this into account. Representatives were cut, and when they were cut, they would actually, like blood brothers in a treehouse somewhere when you were a kid, and you cut your fingers and you mingled the blood, and now we're blood brothers. Remember that stuff? Some of you do? Okay, good. That's old covenant stuff. In fact, today in a Bailey's Bank in Africa, where covenant language is still much a part of their culture, you can't even write a check without reaching through the little teller hole and touching fingers with the teller on the other side. That says you can count on me. It's a covenant sign. It's like a signature. They would actually cut their palms, and they would raise their hands to God and vow to God, and then they'd lower their hands and they'd grab arms. What does that look like? That's covenant stuff. That's covenant stuff. And then after that, they would often put wood ash in the actual cut because they cherished the scar. If they put that wood ash in there, it would turn it dark and make the scar very, very prominent. And covenant keepers, the kind of people that would keep their word, would often prove it and validate it, not by going to some court. Back then, they didn't have records written down in a court of law so much as in the field, they would just raise their hand, and that would say, I'm in covenant. I'm in covenant. If you take me on, there's someone else you got to worry about. See, the covenant. It was right there in the scar. It was a sign of their pledge to one another. And on wedding people's hands, there's still a scar. They're much more attractive now. They're made of gold. There's not a whole lot of shedding of blood at wedding services anymore. White dresses, it would be awful. But there is a scar that we take forward on our hand that says, I belong to somebody. I belong to somebody, and they belong to me. Right? There was this pledging of defense to one another. Once you gave them your coat, you would also show them your armor. If not, give them your sword. Give them your armor as a pledge of defense to one another. Today, Ronald Reagan, I had to go back a ways to find a president that maybe we wouldn't be upset about. But when he was sworn in, he raised his right hand. Why? That's covenant stuff. So help me God. Do you hear it? It still rings in our culture in ways that sometimes, why would you do that? That's old covenant language coming through even in our practices of today. But they would pledge their defense to one another. But not only that, they would also pledge themselves to bless one another, to be the one that blesses each other. A person's debt was my debt if I was in covenant with them. Their need was my need if I was in covenant with them. And we would not only defend one another when times were tough, but there was an understanding that we were vowing to renew this relationship in such a way that we would surprise one another with the goodness we'd bestow on one another. And in doing so, with not only mutual defense, but mutual blessing and mutual identification. Interesting, we still take each other's names when we get married in covenant with each other. That's a covenant. That's why I keep referring to marriage. They share a name after that. Just like Sarai and Abram, when they cut covenant with God, took on the Ruach of God, and they became Sarah and Abraham. There's such an identity there that binds them to one another, that they even take on each other's name. That mutual blessing will follow them all their days of their life. And as they bless one another over time, there's a certain kind of confidence and assurance and that the whole Old Testament gives a special word, and the word is hesed. Last week I thought maybe I got it wrong. I was seeing it spelled CH said. But that's because it's real hard to translate into English that Hebrew sound. The hack, you know? But that's the word. It is said. Okay? If you say that right now, just wipe off the back of the neck of the person in front of you. But said. Yeah? This is the stuff, this deep love, loyalty, this certainty with one another, this appreciation, this deep valuing is all a part of what's anticipated when we cut covenant with one another. And Jonathan and David cut covenant with one another. Last week we talked a good deal about how Jonathan proved his love loyalty to David again and again by defending David, by championing David, by advocating for David, by going to David when he was in trouble. Again and again, Jonathan expresses his love loyalty to David. Well, what about David's love loyalty to Jonathan? That's what I want to get to today. Let's turn the table and look on the other side of this. How was David loyal to Jonathan? When was Jonathan in need and David came through? Well, I think there are three principal times. And here's the first one I want to look at. One of the ways he was faithful to Jonathan, if we'll go to the next slide, was he was sparing of Jonathan's dad, Saul. In the scriptures over and over again, Saul pursues David because he is so jealous of David, so suspicious of David, that he wants to wipe David out because he sees them as a rival to his throne. And so again and again, Saul gets on these rages where he throws a spear across the room trying to pin him to the wall. And Jonathan helps David escape. Or he goes seeking David. David has to leave town because of Saul's great jealousy and bloodthirstiness for him. And this is one of those occasions. It happens again and again. One time in a cave in En-Gedi. And then again he pursues him in the wilderness. And David has to go on the run to leave his wife, Michal, Jonathan's sister, that he's now been pledged to, because that was the reward for killing Goliath, as he was now married to King Saul's daughter, Jonathan's sister, Michal. Draw that family tree in your head real quick. Do you follow me? Michal was her name. Not that that's not confusing enough on her own. I'm almost tempted to call her Michelle, just so it's easier. But Michal, what was her name? Saul is out seeking David's life again and again. And on repeated occasions, David is given a golden opportunity to take out Saul. The first time this happens, David is hiding in the hills and in the caves of the wilderness. And Saul comes seeking his life. And Saul, there were no quick trips around, so he takes a moment to relieve himself. And he goes into a cave for this moment of privacy, not realizing that David is already hid out in the cave, right? And David is so stealthy, is that a word? That he comes up behind Saul while he's relieving himself and cuts off a corner of his cloak. Does not take his life, though he obviously could have. Saul goes out to his men, and as he rejoins his men, David comes out of the cave and says, "King Saul, why do you pursue my life? You pursue my life for no reason, but I will not strike down the Lord's anointed." If this is God's plan, God can work that out. But you're God's anointed, and He made you king, and I'm not going to help myself by killing you. Why is it that men have disturbed you? David thought that someone had told Saul some lie, that he was vying for his throne. And David didn't want anything to do with that. He wanted to honor Saul. Again and again, he says that he will not take the life of Saul because he is the Lord's anointed. Here, in this particular passage, Saul is pursuing David, and David and I think it's Abiathar, his right-hand guy, go into the camp, sneak around in the camp, and find Saul, the king, asleep in the center of the camp with his sword stuck in the ground by his head for easy access. You know, it's kind of like a guy sleeping next to his gun at night, I guess, you know. It's right there by his head. And they come upon him, and Abiathar goes, "Look, God has set it up." And he grabs the sword, and he starts to run Saul through. And David says, "No, we cannot touch the Lord's anointed." And David takes the spear, and again, the next morning in the daylight, he raises the king's spear and says, Look, I could have taken your life, but I didn't. The Lord be judge between me and you, and the Lord revenge me with you." But David would not touch Saul. I think part of it was because he saw him as the chosen one of God, the Lord's anointed. But I think also when you cut covenant with someone, you not only were now faithful to him, you were faithful to his people. You with me? Because of covenant, also I believe David would not touch the Lord's anointed. Here's another one. Not only did he spare Jonathan's father, but he also married Jonathan's sister. That's number B here. And interestingly enough, though Michal and he are married, when Saul goes crazy and Jonathan tells David, "You've got to leave," Michal helps David escape. But he escapes on his own. His wife was willing to spare his life and to help him leave, but she wasn't going to leave the palace. And so interestingly enough, Michal is called Saul's daughter far more often than she is called David's wife. And nevertheless, we'll find out in 2 Samuel, when Jonathan and Saul are dead, and David is coming into the throne, and even then he does not push for power. Even then he lets those of Saul's house still try to vie for retaining the crown and so forth. And then finally the general of Saul's son turns on him and comes to David and said, "Make your covenant with me and I will turn all of Israel over to you." And David says, "Fine, if God has sent you to me, I will make a covenant with you. But before I make a covenant with you, you must bring me Michal." He would not allow her the shame of being a dispossessed royalty. This woman that had turned her back on him, she was now married to another whose name was Palti. And Palti was someone that King Saul, after David left, gave his daughter to in marriage, even though she was still married with David. What an incredible thing. After that kind of disrespect is shown him, for him to cover the shame of Michal, before he ever becomes king, he will reclaim her as his queen. That's incredible to me. What an incredible loyalty. But Jonathan's people are now his people, right? Michal was not only his wife, Michal was also Jonathan's sister. Interesting to point out. And the third of all, and there's another one in there. The third one is this big one here, and this is John's son. Jonathan had many sons, and he has one son that was easy to forget about. When Jonathan and Saul, king and prince, later die on the mountain Gilboa, fighting the Philistines together. Jonathan was loyal to his father even until the end. He died in battle with Saul. And yet that never compromised his greater loyalty. And I say greater greater loyalty to David. They have a saying in covenant-keeping cultures, and it goes like this: blood is thicker than water. Now, because we often think of blood as family descent, he's my blood. You know what I'm talking about? We have to think of it, and they're talking covenant blood. Covenant blood shed with a brother is more powerful, more important than birth waters, than familial bonds. Now, I could go into marital counseling right here and blended family dynamics right here. If you understand covenant, ladies and gentlemen, biblically, the one that you are in covenant relationship is of a higher priority than your relationship to your kids. Now, I've probably just ticked some people off, but this is how God orders it. And it's amazing when we place our covenant partners as primary, our kids almost always get blessed. But whenever we place our kids above our marriage and our marriage comes apart, who bears the wounds of that the most? But the kids. I think God knows what he's talking about. I really think he does. And though this may not be something that is instinctive for us, God's wisdom is not always instinctive, right? It's just always right. I can imagine, can't you, David? He's, well, let me pick up the story. Jonathan and Saul fall dead in battle, which leaves the palace without a king. Now, in most cultures, when one king is gone, they didn't have a Republican election. It was a coup of power that usually followed. And whoever became king, their first act of establishing their throne was usually wiping out any rivals to that throne in the preceding family or dynasty, right? So as David is left to be king, because not only Saul but his son Jonathan, who was the prince, are dead, there's now this power struggle. Now Saul had other sons, and one of those sons even claimed to be king over the northern part of the country, while David was already accepted as king of Judah in the southern part. But as those tensions develop, David doesn't push it. But Saul's family is trying to hang on to some semblance of power. On the day that Jonathan and Saul die, on the day that news gets to the palace, you can read about this in 1 Samuel 4:4. That's where this son of Jonathan is first mentioned. His name is Mephibosheth. And on the day that the news got to the palace, the house of Saul went into a panic. They thought their lives were on the line. They assumed that whoever would be king would be coming for them next. And one of the maidservants picks up this son, who was 4 or 5 years old at the time, grabs him up in her arms and starts running from the palace to save his life and her life. And as she runs, he falls. And this son named Mephibosheth, I'm going to call him Bo. Okay? Mephibosheth is now crippled. It's not clear exactly how it happened. It said Mephibosheth fell, and he was then crippled in both of his feet. Somehow, in a tragic fall, maybe on the steps of the palace, maybe under the weight of this caregiver who fell upon him. We don't know exactly, but somehow his legs were so damaged that he was now crippled in both of his feet. David overcomes those years of civil war, I guess you would call it, tensions between the house of Saul and David. And those who are of the house of Saul eventually come to trust David. They're around David, and he even makes them some of his servants, because after all, Saul's people, because of Jonathan, are whose people? David's people, because of covenant. And though this was not instinctive, and though this was not the pattern that usually would happen, because of covenant, history is changed here. And David gets established in his throne. He not only takes power, but he starts overcoming all of the territories around him. He expands Israel dramatically until it's more than 100% it was before. He dramatically expands the reign of the kingdom of Israel that Saul had known. He brings the Ark of the Covenant home to Jerusalem. He thinks about building God a temple. After all, he says, I live here in this house and God's Ark of the Covenant dwells in a tent. This isn't right. In his heart, he wants to honor God. So he decides to build a temple. Asks Nathan if that'd be all right. And Nathan thinks, well, that sounds like a good idea to me, but he hadn't consulted God. So Nathan then has dreams that night in which God tells him, no, he's not to build me a temple. I am his covenant partner, and I choose to bless him. And because David has this kind of heart, he says, I will call forth rulers to come from you. And that first messianic, Davidic son of David promise is made to the house of David at that point. And so not only is he established, not only has he expanded, but now God has given him a special word that he will remain king and descendants will come from him who will be kings. The Messiah will come from him that will be a king. All that is told him. And then David kind of looks around. He's in the palace. And I wondered if it was then that he realized something's missing. Jonathan, when they had cut covenant previously, said, even if it costs me my life, I'll be faithful to you. And Jonathan is now dead. David longs now that he's the one in power to bless Jonathan in some way, but Jonathan's gone. Jonathan had said, someday even my father knows that you will be king. And David, when you become king, I will be at your side. I won't be the prince that is a rival to you. I'll be the one that champions you. We're in covenant with one another. And Jonathan said, he says this with his life. He pledges himself to be at David's side. But where's Jonathan now? I'm sure David's remembering that promise. When in 2 Samuel chapter 9, in the palace, he asks a question. And the question is this: who of the house of Saul and Jonathan is left for me to bless? Jonathan's not there, but covenants were lifelong. As long as you had life, you would honor your covenant, right? That's the way covenants were. And so he's asking, who of Jonathan's house remains, that I might remember them for Jonathan's sake? You know what he's talking about. He's talking covenant loyalty. He's talking about surprising someone with hesed, right? And at that point, a former servant of Saul comes forth. His name is Ziba. Say Ziba. Ziba, yeah, just Ziba. And Ziba comes forth and he says, I know of one that remains. And he says, King David, his name is Mephibosheth. And he's a young man that is crippled in both his feet. And he is hid away in a town called Lo-debar. It just sounds like one of those places Clint Eastwood is supposed to walk through, doesn't it? You see the tumbleweeds blowing through town, the saloon doors open. Welcome to Lo-debar. It's just desolate. You picture it? This is where Mephibosheth is. He is hid out in Lo-debar, right? He's crippled in both his feet. Since the time he was 5, he asked his nanny, "Why am I crippled in both my feet?" "Oh, my son, we had to save your life from David." "Why did you have to save my life?" "Well, because kings do that. Kings flex their muscle and they exercise their power, and all they're interested in is themselves. And if we had left you there in the palace, surely you would be dead. So now you're just crippled in both your feet, poor Bo, but it's better than it could have been." Maybe all his life he's heard these stories of David. David that would have displaced Saul. Saul, who was always suspicious of David. Saul, who was always jealous of David. Saul, who saw in David an eventual threat that came to pass. David. You can't trust David. David's out for himself. David's against the house of Saul. Can you imagine the resentment in his heart? The throne that could have been his, he's displaced because of David, right? And then David hears about this son Mephibosheth, and he says, very well, he sends his riders to go and get him. Can you imagine? He's in his little Lo-debar shack, and the dust is approaching. The chariots, the horsemen, the henchmen, obviously of David. Someone's told on him. He's been found out. And what's David coming for? Is this good news or bad news? What do you think Bo thinks of it? He thinks this is the worst news of all, right? He's been found out, and sure enough, the henchmen get off their horses, and they come into the house, and they said, "Is there a Mephibosheth here?" And he says, "Yes, I am." They say, "Stand up." He says, "I can't stand up. I'm crippled in both my feet." Thanks to David. And all they say is, "The king summons you. You will come with us." They put Mephibosheth on the chariots. They take him back to the palace. They bring in Mephibosheth before David. And I want to read to you exactly what happens. It's in 2 Samuel. This is an amazing story. In 2 Samuel chapter 9. Well, there they are. Daddy's readers. Okay, good. Okay, here we go. Then David, starting in verse 5, then David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul. Do you hear how it's even mentioned as a kingly line, right? So Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face, prostrated himself before him. He's on his face in the dust. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he said, "Here is your servant." Now earlier, Ziba had come in when David asked the question, and he said, "Here is your servant." It's with a period. But when Mephibosheth, you note, says it, it's with an exclamation mark. He's scared spitless. "Here is your servant." Right? It's that kind of thing. And David said to him, "Do not fear." Why? Because he's obviously scared out of his wits. "Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you." The word is hesed. "I will show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land that your grandfather Saul, land of your grandfather Saul." Remember, he had expanded the kingdom. So he gave him everything that would have been his had he been king. He's inviting him to live like a king. "And you shall eat at my table regularly." Again, he prostrated himself and said, "What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me. It's the actual words. I'm a dead dog. What are you saying? I was expecting an axe across my neck. Oh, properties of my grandfather Saul. What? It's so counter to what he expects, he can't even process it. He's been offered the possibility to live like a king. And he says, who am I, a worm? Who am I, this dead dog? Something's not computing. This does not add up. And then the king called Saul's servant, Ziba, and said to him, apparently he realizes he's not going to get through to Mephibosheth talking to him directly. All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson, Mephibosheth. And you and your son, your servants, shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson, Mephibosheth, may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. He was no second-rate servant of the king. And then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servants, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table. Wow. What an incredible story. David has just made Mephibosheth the offer of a lifetime. He's saying, you, Mephibosheth, need not return to your hut in Lo-debar. I will make you to live like a king. It doesn't make sense to him. It's too good to be true. He's expected revenge. David is offering him redemption. He expected hostility. David is offering him unparalleled hospitality. He expected a curse, and David is blessing him. He expected punishment, and David is restoring to him the full kingdom that was Saul's. Why? Why? I'll tell you why. Is because David had cut covenant with Jonathan. Jonathan, though he was one of Saul's family, was so different from Saul's family. Like Mephibosheth and Saul, they were both men of great suspicion. But Jonathan had a heart that was knit to the heart of David. His heart was as David's heart. He was part of the family, but it was almost as if he was not a part of it. He was so different. And David is offering this to Jonathan, not based on anything Jonathan has done, not even based on who Jonathan is. He's doing this based on whose Jonathan is. David is doing this based on covenant. He has cut covenant with Jonathan. And Mephibosheth is one of Jonathan's people. So Mephibosheth has a decision. Apparently it's one he must make quickly, but it goes against everything that's in his nature. He's learned through the years he could only trust himself. He's learned most of all, you'd better not trust the one that's in power. And now he's got a decision to make. Does he return to Lo-debar, that familiar place where he's in control? Or does he live like a king and give up control? What did Mephibosheth do? Verse 13 tells a story, almost in phrases. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem. He didn't go back to Lo-debar. He accepted the offer of living like a king, for he ate at the king's table regularly. And for the life of me, it's a puzzle to me while chapter 9 does not end right there. If this was a movie, this is where the credits start coming up. But that's not where this passage ends. There's one more phrase. Now he was lame in both his feet. What? Is there a sequel? What? That's not where this is supposed to end. He's lame in both his feet. He's just been given the opportunity to live like a king. He has said yes to that. He's lame in both his feet, yes. In this life, my friends, your scars become trophies of His grace. All those ways that you are not deserving just magnify the magnitude of His grace to accept you, to love you, to claim you as His own son. Mephibosheth is learning that his brokenness is a token that will always remind him of his great blessing. But my friends, this isn't just Mephibosheth's story, it's ours. You can live like a king too. Why? Why would God bless us like that? It's not because of anything you've done. It's not even because of who you are. It can be because of whose you are. Jonathan, his very name means God has given. Many see in this story of Jonathan a forward-looking picture of Jesus. For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. A Son that cuts covenant with humanity. He's one of us, but His heart is so different from us. And yet He's one of us, so He can cut covenants with us. And He's God, so He can represent God too. So both representatives, they're in one person. And God has cut covenant with humanity through Jesus. And if you will be His, God says you will be mine. God cut covenant 2,000 years ago with a human being just like you, a son of man. And if we choose to belong to Him, then God is saying today, as much as He says any day and at any time, God is asking that question that the sovereign asks in this passage, that David asks in this passage, and it is there anyone left in the house of humanity, of fallen humanity, that I might not show them my loving kindness for the sake of Jesus? God has cut covenant with us. Jesus lifted up a cup and He said, "This is my blood, a new covenant, my blood shed for you. A new covenant I give you, that you might love one another as I loved you." Why is that? Why love one another as I have loved you? Because if you cut covenant with me, you are pledging yourself to love my people. And you'll never lock eyes with a single human being in this world for whom Jesus did not shed the last drop of pure devotion. He bled Himself dry for this world. And if we're covenant partners with Him, we may not be like David was able to share, has said, with Jesus on a cross. Jesus is not physically in our midst, just like Jonathan was not in the palace, but we can find those sons and daughters of humanity that are so broken, that need a blessing, that have this contrary picture of the God that loves them and would call them to live with Him as kings. But they've heard a different story about God. Maybe as many of us have. And they, as we, have a decision. Whose will we be? Will we trust Jesus? Can we see in Him the heart of the Father that is reaching out to us, calling us from our sheds of Lodabar and saying, if you'll love my Son, you'll know my love. And if you cut covenant with Him, if you belong to Him, then love my people. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you loved us as Jonathan loved David. That you cut covenant with us for the sake of bringing us to the Father. And Father, this morning we renew our covenant with you. We come to you this morning. If there's anyone here within the sound of my voice that has never accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and as your Savior, if you have not said, Lord, be my master, be my Savior, then maybe this is all for you today. God is asking right now, who can I bless for the sake of my Son, Jesus? Who can I invite to eat from my table and to live like a king? As a servant of the King, can I give him your name? Would you give him your name? If so, this altar's for you. This is a place where you can decide that because of Jesus, because of the covenant that God has cut with all of us, that from this day forward, you don't have to live as a cripple. You don't have to live as one marked by your brokenness. You can live out your destiny. You can live with God. You can live like a king. Receive it, I pray. Receive it right now. You are not what this life and this world tells you you are. You are royalty. You are a son and daughter of the Most High. And if you're loved like that, you need not be like that anymore. Claim his claiming of you this day. Come to this altar. Join his people. And let's love one another as he has loved us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we pray. Let's stand this morning and sing our closing hymn.